Well, hello. I am Jamie Parker of Process Plus Results and the host of the Lean Leadership for Ops Managers podcast. It might be a little bit of a surprise here. I'm actually guest hosting today for a very special episode where I'm going to interview Mark Graban today. Now, I know that you know Mark from the host of My Favorite Mistake. What you may not know is he also hosts several other podcasts, including Habitual Excellence, the Lean Whiskey podcast, and also the Lean Blog podcast. So if you want to catch him somewhere else, you may want to check one of those out too. All right, so let's just dive in. We know we want to get straight to those mistakes. So Mark, thank you for having me.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, let's jump in here. Why don't you tell us about one of your favorite mistakes?
Yeah, well, so this is a more recent mistake. It's probably not amongst my favorite of all time, but I thought it was worth talking through. And so, Jamie, thank you for accepting my introduction to kind of turn the tables after having you on the show. Going back about 2 weeks ago, to jump to the end of what I thought had happened, I thought basically due to a combination of an external hard drive crash and a couple of poor decisions on my part, we can call these process problems, that I have complete ownership of.
Okay.
Not the victim here. I thought I had lost across the Habitual Excellence podcast and here on My Favorite Mistake, something like 7 podcasts that I had recorded with different guests in a week. I thought the hard drive was toast, unrecoverable, gone. And for reasons I can maybe explain, I had no backup.
Ouch.
I had the drive backed up, but that week did not get backed up. And I had already sent emails out to these different guests apologizing profusely that I believe the recording that we had done was lost. And would you please consider re-recording and taking another half hour out of your busy schedule? So do you want to hear a little bit? I'm going to see how interesting of a story I can make this.
All right. So you had this backup, but not for the last week. So there was something in place, but now we've got a potential major issue. Tell us more. What happened?
Yeah. So there were a number of factors, and like the work I've done in healthcare, not to get too sidetracked on this, the quality improvement and patient safety people often talk about something called the Swiss cheese model. You may have a process with different protections in place, but if everything goes wrong all at once, like if you think of all the slices of cheese, if they were on an arrow running through them and the slices of cheese could rotate, like all the holes have to line up just perfectly, and occasionally that's going to happen. What happened in my situation here was fairly similar. So I record episodes and put them on an external hard drive. This is a Mac-based system, and I use a service called Backblaze, which automatically, continually in the background, backs up the hard drive on my laptop and the external drive. And so then I was back in Texas for a week, which is kind of secondary permanent home. And the beauty of the external hard drive is that you can plug it into, and at that home, I have an iMac sitting on the desk. So I was using that to record the interviews. I was throwing the files onto the external drive because I knew I would be coming back to California after a week. So then when I had that crash, so there were a couple of mistakes I made. One was that instead of if I had just copied the files from the iMac to the external drive, they would have still been on the iMac. So I moved the files to the external hard drive, which I thought was being backed up continually, automatically by Backblaze. Now, I'm not blaming Backblaze. I've been very happy with their service. They helped me recover from the hard drive crash, everything that had been backed up. But I made a bad assumption. So I think this is very, sometimes technology companies will blame user error, and we feel like, oh, that's not fair. You should have made it easier to use. So a bad assumption and lack of research on my part is that I assumed that that external hard drive, when it was plugged into the iMac, would also be backed up because that iMac had Backblaze software running on it as well. So the mistake I made was not understanding that it was only going to back up when it was plugged into my laptop.
Yeah.
So there were a number of these factors where if the hard drive had failed when I was in California, I would have had a complete full backup thanks to Backblaze. And again, like they're not a sponsor. I'm not blaming them. I'm happy with Backblaze. So, it's kind of the timing of when the hard drive crashed was
Yes.
maybe some bad luck.
The holes in the cheese are starting to line up. I can see it.
They lined up that week. So there are a number of things that, had I done differently or had circumstances been different, I wouldn't have lost the data. So I learned from this, and I could start thinking through different countermeasures of, backing up. I could have the files on the external drive, and I could also back them up in Dropbox. Mm-hmm. I have the storage capacity for that. So I was already down this path of thinking about, short-term recovery, of apologizing to the guests, and most of them were very gracious. I hadn't heard back from a few people. Nobody was mean about it.
Yeah.
Everyone was very understanding about it, which I appreciate greatly. And I was already thinking through, okay, countermeasures to prevent this from ever happening again. Mm-hmm. But then it occurred to me, like, well, maybe the drive isn't as dead as I think it is. And so I found a piece of software that I was able to download, said, okay, it'll scan the drive and tell you if any of the files are recoverable. And if so, you can pay $40 to recover them. So that software helped me quickly realize, okay, the drive isn't completely dead. It appears there's data there. For some reason, my Macs cannot read the drive. Mm-hmm. So it took about 24 hours literally for that software to run. And realized that, yes, I was actually able to recover all of those files. So then I was able to send a happier email.
Yes.
Space Cadet. Wait, never mind. The files are lost. We don't have to re-record. I'm going to now cancel the re-record sessions that had already been scheduled. So in a way, all's well that ends well. I didn't have the data loss, but to frame it in terms of healthcare or other situations, I would call this a near miss. And mm-hmm. even though it worked out well in the end, there are still huge learning opportunities that I can, and I can put measures in place to make sure that this potential near miss failure doesn't happen again.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, especially because you did have some countermeasures in place beforehand, right? So, this wasn't brand new problem. You've been podcasting a while, you put some measures in place, all the holes lined up.
Right.
And then you're going to say, oh, I'm going to make changes to my processes now.
Yeah. And I made a couple of changes. One is that, my experience with these external hard drives of different brands, whether I'm using them for time machine backups or additional storage, they will fail after a couple of years. It's just a matter of when, not if.
Oh, I'm thinking I have one that I might need to think through that on.
This is part of why I wanted to do the episode, as self-indulgent as it might seem, is that others can maybe, including yourself, can learn from my mistakes or my near miss. So it's a little bit more expensive, but I bought as an external drive, not the traditional spinning hard drive, but it's now an external SSD, solid state drive, which could still get corrupted. There are still reasons to back that up, which it's now happily doing, connected to my MacBook Pro. And again, thank you, Backblaze. That drive is less likely to fail. There are still risks that I could lose the drive or that it could get corrupted in some way. So I'm still doing the backup. So to me, that's sort of like, maybe now belt and suspenders. Could I add a second pair of suspenders by also keeping the files in something like Google Drive or Dropbox? Maybe I should still consider that.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that, as I hear you telling this story, is that there was a happy ending in this case where for just $40, you're able to recover all of these. And it strikes me that there's even a lesson there too, because despite that happy ending, you're still making those countermeasure changes in your process.
Well, I think it's, as we, see in healthcare, there are so many more near misses than there are actual
Mm.
incidents. So that makes it all the more important to learn from a near miss before it becomes a harm incident, or to even be proactive, which is what it seems like maybe you're doing now. You're being proactive, Jamie, in response to my story of what can we do to prevent unsafe conditions, or
Mhm.
let's eliminate risks instead of
Yes.
just responding when there's a known near miss. So I think that's one of the other lessons or reflections that I have from my day job of kind of trying to apply that here to the podcasting realm.
Fantastic. So any other kind of broad general lessons that you think, as far as how do you take this and then apply it to maybe something that's not related to your podcast technology?
The idea of learning from mistakes, or
Yeah.
yeah, well, I mean, hopefully, I mean, I think easier said than done, but trying to find ways to reflect
Mhm.
on what we've done, and not even the things that were like a gut punch, like thinking I'd almost lost this data really hit me hard for a day and a half. And I had no one to blame but myself, and I went through all the stages of grief in a way. But I thought, okay, well, I've got to learn from it, and try to carry on. Kind of like, when I think of situations in my career, other mistakes that were formative, like, in a maybe even a deeper way than a potential hard drive crash would
Yeah.
have been. So, you've got the book Practicing Lean over your
Yeah.
shoulder. I'm going to again hold up a copy of it. Jamie contributed a chapter. I wrote a chapter. Can I share one of the stories?
I would, yes, let's hear one of those stories from a mistake. We had heard your recent mistake, maybe one of the other mistakes that might be one of your favorites.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's a common theme between the book Practicing Lean and this podcast, My Favorite Mistake, of learning from what we've done, realizing we're all human. At some point in our career, we're all going to make mistakes. But I think one of the keys is learning from them
Hmm.
and moving forward. So one of the stories that I shared in my chapter in the book was, thinking back, this was going back to 2004. This is the last manufacturing company that I worked for. And I was in an internal process improvement role. My job title on my business card, which I hated, by the way, said lean expert.
Oh, wow.
I'm like, I don't like that job title at all. That flies in the face of what it means to practice something. Like, if I'm an expert, does that imply that I know it all? I don't have to continue learning. You reacted really strongly to that title. What comes to mind for you?
Well, especially the self-described expert. Like, it might be one thing if I say, "Oh, you know what? I think really need to talk to Mark. He's an expert in lean healthcare." Where I'm
Well,
deciding that, from my perspective, you have that expertise, but that self-described expert, I think, is what I was reacting to.
I don't even like it if you were to be so kind as to describe me an expert in something. Now, it was a corporate decision that I had the certification similar to a
Hmm.
black belt that they called lean expert. But I begged and pleaded, could I please put anything different on my business card, like lean coach or lean facilitator, or even no job title? I think
Uh-huh.
would have been better, but the bureaucracy said no. Um, so anyway, in that organization, as part of that certification, I was expected to go do a project out in a production area. And I went through, long story short, there was an opportunity to use some lean methods. And I created, if people know the jargon in our field, a production Kanban system of
Hmm.
basically determining and doing the math what the batch sizes should have been on some different components, and how often the setups on those machines should be done, and what the sequence of those setups should be. It was a technically correct, well-designed system that got me certified, but it
Hmm.
ended up having no benefit to the business. You know why? You
Mm.
can probably guess.
Tell us why.
But nobody used it. What point is there in designing this technically
Hmm.
correct system that would have been helpful, except nobody used it? And now I'm not going to blame the people in that department for
Hmm.
not using the system. This is on me, and to some extent on the organization, right?
Hmm.
So I'm kind of sent in to swoop in, to do the analysis, to come up with a solution, to put it together. I talked to the people working in the area, but now I recognize I didn't fully engage them as much as I should have. Now I can, I've reflected on that, and that's been inspiration to me to make sure I do more of that. In my defense, at the risk of sounding like I'm blaming the organization I worked for, it was not a highly participatory culture.
Yes.
I was a little bit afraid that if I had done more to engage folks, that I would have gotten in trouble for interrupting them or bothering them or getting in the way of them doing their production work. So I don't, there's maybe divided responsibility. I could have done more. Like my gut was telling me I need to involve people more, even before I realized, all right, oh gosh, nobody's using this. And, I think within the boundaries of that culture, I could have engaged people because I thought it was the right thing to do. And if I wasn't courageous enough, or I don't know what word would be correct to use. But, I've tried to learn from that and realize, for one, now as an external consultant, I'm not going to allow myself to be placed into a situation where I'm expected to come in as the expert and design something and hand it off. I don't want to do that again.
Well, and I think we see that so often, whether it's an external consultant or an internal, whatever, whether it's continuous improvement or something else, where someone, right, it could be in HR, it could be in any group that, that defines this, creates it, and then hands it over to somebody else to execute. Yeah.
So we that's the difference between, as many put it, doing change to people instead of doing change with people.
Yeah.
And then I'm curious, I almost feel like I'm back into interviewer mode, but I'm going to throw it back to you, Jamie. At what point do you look at, okay, well, here's what the culture is and what the culture would want me to do or pressure me to do versus me doing what I think is right? That's tough to navigate.
It is tough to navigate. And, I actually have felt this and experienced this recently with COVID-19 and what I believe to be safe precautions. And then, being on site with a client with masks and physical distancing and all of that. But then there being some activity where that's not happening and kind of feeling like, whoa, what's I have a responsibility to myself and to can be authentic here as well. And I think that's so common that we have this. One of the things that I see is that I actually think that culture is local, meaning that we can have an organizational culture, but really we can still have this local culture based off of the leadership and the team and how we're working together.
Yeah.
And so that's an opportunity to say, gosh, you know what, let's change our culture together.
I've seen that a lot within hospitals. A departmental director can do a lot to create a local culture within their team. Even if the broader organization as a whole is not engaging everybody in continuous improvement, it can be done locally. There's maybe some risk that someone higher up the chain makes a decision that counteracts some of that, but that local culture can be pretty resilient, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. And, if we can just look at organizations and see this when you have a leader leave, and then it seems like everything changes in that department, whether we would classify it as for the good or for the bad, right? And either way, we can see that when a leader leaves, or it could even be an influencer, a strong influencer
within the team.
Within the team. Yeah.
And one other thought about this situation back at this manufacturing company, where if it's something related to health and safety, like you're describing, I would probably be more likely to buck the culture. And there are times, going back to even my first job out of college, where I made waves, and some people, I remember the maintenance manager in particular in the first plant I worked in, did not like me because I kept speaking up about safety risks that were not being fixed. I thought they were not being prioritized properly. And calling that out led to, that maintenance leader feeling personally attacked. And, but there's a point of like, am I here to make friends, or am I here to look out for the safety of the people working in these departments that I'm engineer for? And then there was one other time where, from a quality standpoint, this could have ended up being a my favorite mistake story. But long story short, and I've blogged a longer version of it. Maybe I can put into the show notes. When I was at General Motors, I had a really serious quality concern about some connecting rods, which are metal pieces that are inside the engine. And I thought some really bad decisions were being made. And I tried escalating this, and I wasn't getting any sort of response through the direct kind of proper channels. So I thought, well, I can make one last appeal to my industrial engineering boss, who heard me out and agreed, but I think he didn't feel like he could do much anything about it. So I thought, okay, I need to be more dramatic. And so I marched out to the factory, grabbed one of these connecting rods. It was dripping in grease, carried it through the factory, through the office. If I remember correctly, I was probably dripping grease on the carpet, which I apologize to the housekeeping crew for that. But basically marched into my boss Sid's office and kind of semi-slammed this greasy connecting rod part down onto his desk. And I thought, well, I don't know if this is going to end up being a fireable offense on some level. But it was a point where I felt strongly enough about it, and I didn't really care about any consequences. Like, it might have ended up being a favorite mistake story of like, yeah, maybe I lost my cool and that wasn't the best way to make a point, but it was better that I left that organization anyway. But, to his credit, Sid realized that, okay, yeah, I cared enough about this and it was serious enough. And I explained again what was going on. And, he went and sort of took on that charge as my manager.
Yeah.
Didn't get fired.
Didn't get fired.
But there are times when maybe there are noble firings, and I don't know if it would have been one.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly choices and decisions we make, for our alignment with an organization, and and to feel like we can make those decisions. I know there are a lot of folks who feel like, hey, I can't, from economic situation or whatever else.
Right, and that's where it's like one other soapbox issue is, in healthcare when. I think we can't lecture people that you should speak up, like a nurse or an OR tech who doesn't speak up about a physician's bad behavior, or doesn't speak up about an impending safety risk, because people do fear retaliation. And they do get retaliated against. And so I always think, like, if I were, a single parent, I was the only paycheck and I had children at home, and I'm going to be really super cautious, and I wouldn't expect anyone to jeopardize their job or their family or their home or something like that. While someone else might be in different personal circumstances where they could make a favorite mistake and do something that, I hate to see someone fired for speaking up, but they might also rationalize, hey, that wasn't really a place I was happy at anyway.
Yeah. It strikes me, I hear a lot, kind of in that continuous improvement space, this idea, we talk a lot about, the need for senior leadership, engagement, and active involvement and things like that. And when I go to conferences or talk to other practitioners, I hear a lot about I just don't have that. We don't have that. We don't have that. What do I do? And there always is, of course, the opportunity to leave if that's a choice you want to make. But I also think that it's so important to recognize the influence we do have.
Sure.
And saying, okay, but I may not be able to change the whole organization, but I bet I can still improve lives right here within my span of influence.
Yeah. That's well said. And I'm going to throw it back to you for another plug for your podcast, Jamie. Our guest host here has been Jamie Parker. Among other things, she has a podcast called Lean Leadership for Ops Managers. I have that correct, right?
Yeah.
So everyone go check that out. And I know a lot of your early episodes were you sharing thoughts. You've started interviewing people occasionally, right?
I do, yeah. So I've had a couple of interviews so far. One with an ops manager. We had Ron Pereira joined us to talk about lean daily management,
Mhm.
and then an upcoming episode, or potentially just released, is with another couple of practitioners talking about daily meetings. So it's fun to start having some guests on for sure.
Yep. And we're going to give a plug again for practicing lean. This is also practicing interviewing and practicing podcasting, right?
Yes, it is.
So thank you for practicing and being willing to step in and indulge me with an opportunity to talk about some mistakes as a guest here on My Favorite Mistake.
Thank you, Mark. I'm glad to be here and glad to see you leading the way.
Well, I'm trying, and thank you for what you're doing, and we'll keep at it, right?
That's right.
All right.